and this is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. More than ever before, we live in the age of machines. But simple machines, tools, gadgets of various sorts have always driven civilizations, and I guess our species has always sought for ways to get more work out of less effort. And in a way, machines should always improve the human condition. I mean, a medieval peasant who, thanks to the windmill, no longer has to grind wheat by hand should be that much better off for it. But there is a tension here. For new gadgets have been a constant theme throughout history, but it's become more and more clear from past episodes I've done on economic history and books I've read on economic history that this just hasn't been the case. That for most of human history, there really was no positive trend in living standards. So what happened to all the gains from technology? And more importantly, what kind of lessons can we draw from all of this to our own era of computers, robots, and machine learning? To discuss this, I am joined by a very distinguished guest, with little doubt the single most distinguished guest that I've had the privilege to have on so far. That guest is Daron Acemoglu. Acemoglu is a true legend in economics and political science, and if you haven't heard of him, I urge you to just name drop him or his most famous book, Why Nations Fail, to a friend who does economics or politics, and you're almost guaranteed to have an animated response. And Acemoglu really is a great scholar. After reading over 1,000 pages from someone and listening to countless interviews and lectures, you kind of think that you know what's coming. But no, he surprised me, especially towards the end of the conversation, so it's really worth listening till the end. Our chat today focuses on Acemoglu's new book, Power and Progress, co-authored with Simon Johnson. We talk about why new machines have so often failed to benefit the common folk. We talk about why Acemoglu agrees with my previous guests, Oded Galor and Brad DeLong, that this really did change around 150 years ago, but also why he strongly disagrees with them about why. And most importantly, why this disagreement really matters. Why Acemoglu's own theory suggests that there was nothing automatic, nothing preordained about this positive progress, and so it is something that we could easily lose. And indeed, we do talk about very concerning evidence suggesting that we have been backsliding for some time now. But we end on a perhaps more optimistic note, talking about why this is not an inevitable situation of AI doom and gloom. I hope that you enjoyed the conversation. If you do, please do consider becoming a supporter. You can do so via patreon.com. And if you do, I will, of course, send you a personal thank you note, after which we can continue discussing the show or other related themes with you over email. But this said, by the time that this episode drops, I will be sitting a 10-day silent retreat. So it will take some time to hear back from me. But I will hopefully emerge sane from the other side, and we'll get back to you then. Anyway, let's get back to the show now. I bring to you Daron Acemoglu. Professor Daron Acemoglu, welcome to On Humans.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me to your podcast.
So I think a lot of people would say, at least presume, that when new technologies from windmills to steam engines, when they come on board, there is disruption. Some people lose their jobs, but at the end of the day, things will get better. All the boats will be lifted and prosperity will be shared. Does history support this view?
Yes and no. There are some very important episodes in which the disruptive negative effects of technology are seen, but ultimately things work out for the better. But largely no, because the presumption that that was an automatic process is wrong. When new transformative technologies arrive, those who have greater political and social power have a tremendous say in how they are used, the direction in which technologies are developed, and who gets the gains from their application. And sometimes those who are left behind are not just failing to benefit from these new technologies, but they are pressed down even harder than they were before. The ultimate process via which the path of technology and the path of institutions in which these technologies are embedded is one of struggle, and that's why the subtitle of my recent book is Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. Let me give you two examples. In the book there are several others, but two that are both clear and relevant are the introduction of the cotton gin that completely transformed the US South, making that part of the Americas a hub for cotton production, which then became the largest exporters of cotton in the first half of the 19th century, and that fueled the British Industrial Revolution and the expansion of trade in the world, of how institutions matter, because even before the cotton gin arrived, this was a coercive structure where slaves, of course, had no voice and were pressed down hard by coercive means. And once the slave owners wanted to extract more labor from these workers, they didn't pay them better working conditions and higher wages. They just coerced them even more and forced them to move to the deep south.
What about in the absence of slavery?
In the absence of slavery, I think the best example, and to which we owe a lot of our current health, prosperity, and comfort, is the Industrial Revolution. In fact, many people, when they say, look, things have worked out so well in the past, they have in mind the Industrial Revolution. But that's only a partial picture of what happened in the Industrial Revolution. It is true, the process that started sometime in the first half of the 18th century with advances in steam engines and textile technology was truly revolutionary. But for about 100 years, workers did not much benefit from it. From around 750 to around 1850, the real incomes of the working people in England does not seem to have increased much. And their working hours increased by about 20%. Their working conditions got much worse in modern factories where there was a lot more coercion, discipline, lack of autonomy, lack of flexibility. Working conditions were horrible, very noisy, very polluted. Children as young as 5 or 6 were working 18 hours a day in coal mines deep down, giving them a life expectancy of probably in their 20s. And infectious diseases went rampant. Pollution was unbearable. And there was no sign that any of this was automatically going to right itself. Today, if we are looking at a world in which, by and large, hundreds of millions of people, perhaps billions of people, have benefited from industrial technology, that is because institutions and the direction of technology started changing around the middle of the 19th century. Britain became a democracy. That was not a natural process. When the Chartists made some demands for one person, one vote in the 1840s, taking all measures to make sure that they did not appear radical, just making very reasonable demands, demands that today we would find extremely normal and tame, they were able to collect 3 million signatures, 10% of the population, amazing amount of support from the people. And you know what their reward was? They were completely suppressed. All of their leaders were thrown in jail, and the elites did not even want to consider one single one of their recommendations. So democracy came out of a struggle. But with democracy, trade unions became legalized. Trade unions were prosecuted heavily under several laws. And of course, without trade unions, under such harsh conditions, women, children, uh, working people were treated extremely harshly. So that started improving, wages started improving. And the direction of technological change altered quite significantly as well. Early technologies of the Industrial Revolution were all intended to automate work. So, not so much contributing to the workers' productivity and hence wages. In the second half of the 19th century, with more advanced industrial machinery, making workers more productive in factories, railway technology, improving transport, and the types of consumer and producer goods that were available in the market, worker productivity started increasing. And that was not, again, a inevitable process of technological way forward, but explicit choices by employers about how to use technology, how to develop technology. It was these transformative changes that ultimately brought us a modicum of shared prosperity, which then became the basis of 20th century growth.
So let me get this right. The basic idea is that, and you gave a couple of examples, and as you said in the book, there's many more. One of my favorite ones was from the Middle Ages, where in a way the Middle Ages weren't in England, for example, nearly as dark. It seems because there was actually a lot of technological innovation, and after reading, I did realize that actually every single image I can imagine of a medieval town in England will have a windmill and or a watermill. And that these were new technologies which should have created much more prosperity, but actually it's all, you say, extracted by the elites. And For example, in France, was about 20% of GDP is extracted to put into cathedral buildings.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah, I mean it's incredible to imagine. And today, especially people in Europe, and I lived 7 years of my life in Europe, so I have, you know, I was on the same boat. But we celebrate all of these medieval buildings.
oh yeah, I
We
do.
think they are, the highest achievements of our ancestors. But look, I mean, they're beautiful, but they were being built with very scarce resources when millions of people went hungry.
Yeah, yeah. And so the story for most of human history, you would say, is technology can improve, but the living condition of the masses has not improved because the surplus is just extracted by whoever is in charge.
I think there's a lot of variation. In the book, we also discuss, for example, what happened in the several decades after Black Death when the balance in the servile system got disrupted, and suddenly the working people got it into their minds that they could demand better conditions. They could actually walk away from their feudal obligations. Again, that was not a consensual process. Those who somehow, I don't know where they get this idea, but they think of the sort of the past somehow adapting to technological changes or demographic changes. Well, it's not an adaptation in the form that we get together and we say, oh, how can we take better care of this? And how can we make this industrial technology work? The first reaction of the nobles and landowners was to pass the statute of laborers, which made it a serious crime for people to refuse and try to get out of their feudal dues. And they tried to introduce a very heavy amount of coercion so that workers did not get better conditions and higher wages. But with the labor scarcity that had arisen at the time, they couldn't stop the flow.
What's fascinating about this is that I've had both Audit Galore and Brad DeLong on the podcast previously,
Hmm.
and both have written books from very different angles, but
Hmm.
they all agree with you on a very fundamental point, which is that when we look at the broad contours of history, it really seems that it just does not make that much of a difference whether you're a worker in ancient Egypt or pre-modern Venice or wherever. Most of the wages, I mean, Audit Galore even had some wonderful data on this, on how many kilograms of wheat you get paid historically from a working day. It looks the same throughout history.
Absolutely. I think there is broad agreement on this, but the interpretation and the details of that are a little bit different. For example, I think many people are interpreting this through a Malthusian lens, but I think the data does not support that at all.
Well, let me quickly give the case for, so both Galore and DeLong take a somewhat Malthusian approach.
I think it's a problem. It's somehow something that is so attractive to economists, but I don't see the data supporting that.
Okay, well, let me make the case quickly. So what they would say is that in a patriarchal society before birth control, when you get extra technology, it can improve your living conditions for a while. But with the pressure to create male offspring, etc., and no birth control, you're just going to start having population increase. And therefore you might get GDP growth, but you don't get GDP per capita growth. And as an example, there's data from when maize or new crops are introduced to various provinces in China. The ones that get them first get an increase in perhaps wealth, but in the long run, they just get increase in population growth. And Galore especially has a lot of data on this. So I don't want to say that Galore or DeLong definitely focuses also on the extractive elements of pre-modern world.
I mean, I think there are many points of agreement.
Okay, yeah, so exactly. So how deep is the disagreement?
Well, I think if you take a really macro perspective and say you plot working people's income in a single graph for 10,000 years, it might look flat. But if you look at specific episodes, especially institutionally diverse environments, you will see very different changes. Of course, no society in the past has achieved sustained growth, meaning steady growth that's going to go on for a very, very long time. The technologies were not,
and we don't know if we are approaching that.
and we don't know. We've only been doing it for like 150 years or so. But take ancient Greece. There was a period of about 200 years in which real incomes grew, and there is no sign of Malthusian dynamics reversing that. If it was reversed thanks to Alexander the Great.
Yeah, I you know what? I interestingly enough remember seeing those numbers of how many kilograms of wheat, and noticing that Athens was a far outlier that you get
But
wrong?
it's not just Athens, actually. All the city-states, I mean, not all the states, several city-states. Josh Ober's several books are excellent on this, and so is Ian Morris, who has
Okay.
actually compiled data very much actually also taking aim at this sort of Malthusian interpretation, showing several periods in which the Roman Republic had about another 300 years, 250 years of fairly steady growth, followed by another 50 or so years during the Roman Empire of growth. But, just if you're going to see Malthusian dynamics, you should also see them in the pre-state societies as well. But existing evidence suggests that they were, in fact, much better. They were offering much better conditions for regular people.
Okay. And your interpretation is that their elites were not as extractive.
Well, you can, of course, say, oh, those were not fully settled, and when they're not fully settled, perhaps they wouldn't have as many children. I mean, there are reasons, but I'm just emphasizing that having many children and all the surplus being extracted from the workers up to the level of some population growth, those are institutional outcomes. They're not, nature given.
Let's then look at the ways that DeLong and Galore interpret the change. I mean, the change happens in the latter half of 19th century, according to, I think, all of you three.
Yes.
Galore would take the most Malthusian approach, and he has a really interesting logic here,
Mm-hmm.
which is that he really focuses on the demographic transition, the smaller family sizes,
Right.
and his story is that technology has been steadily improving, but technology reaches a tipping point at the end of the 1800s,
Yeah.
after which it is actually important for the industrialists to have well-educated labor, because you have to be able to count, you have to be able to read and write to work in the factories. And so actually it's not so much a political struggle as much as it is, according to him, the British industrialists and other Western industrialists who lobby for public education. When they lobby for public education, they put a lot of pressure on the whole of society to start investing more heavily on fewer children rather than having a lot of children, which then begins the demographic transition. And indeed, when we look at rich countries today, whether East Asia or Western Europe, these are the places with very small family sizes. And so there's kind of two trends in here. One, there's the Malthusian trend, and then there is a very specific claim that actually this was not so much a political fight as much as this was a self-serving policy for the industrialists to start lobbying for public education. You can kind of approach it from either angle, but what would be your pushback?
Let me start with the second part of the argument, and then I'll come back to the first. The second part, I disagree very much. I think any objective reading of history cannot see anything consensual about how these institutions have changed.
Even with public education?
Even with public education. Public education in Britain, for instance, came out of the democracy movement. And it is the same democracy movement that was originally very harshly suppressed. Now, it is true that by the last quarter of the 19th century, in the face of pressure from society, the two major parties, both conservatives and the liberals, start advocating versions of democratic reform. Gladstone for the liberals and Disraeli for conservatives. But it is definitely a mistake to see that as their, consensual way of introducing democracy. They are doing it in the face of it and trying to do it in such a way to build a new coalition that is the Israelis' one nation conservatism. Now, the part that I agree with Oded is that ultimately schools are structured in a way that serves some of the needs of industrialists. That is a point that was originally made. I mean, somebody may make it before then, but I had originally read about this in a classic book by Samuel Bowles and Herb Gintis, which is a little bit more Marxian in its interpretation than mine, but it's a wonderful book called Schooling in America. But the main points that that book makes actually apply to Britain as well, that schools early on became a way of imparting values of obedience so that workers could fit into the factory system and so on.
Or on a more positive note, also the fact that you start needing to be able to count and read and write.
Right, exactly. But don't forget, industrialists were hugely happy to employ children for 80 years. 1840s, 1840s. This is a full 100 years after the introduction of advanced textile and steam mill machinery. Children, very young, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, are working in coal mines with no education, no protection. You know what they're doing? They're pushing carts, heavy carts loaded with coal with their heads. That was completely fine for employers. You know why that changed? Because the conditions were getting so bad that finally there was pressure, and Parliament had called these royal commissions to look into conditions of the working people who were dying and were sick all the time. And that was, the one of the triggers. It wasn't, employers coming together and saying, yeah, we want to sort of improve the education and human capital of workers. But on the other hand, I would agree with the following claim that when labor is scarce, that does create a number of important forces for better form of technological progress. This is an idea that was originally articulated in one way or another, by John Hicks in his theory of wages, and then later in an even more famous form by the famous British economic historian H.J. Habakkuk. So it goes by the name of Habakkuk hypothesis, and then Bob Allen more recently applied similar ideas to the British Industrial Revolution. And we emphasize this a lot in the book, that, for example, in the United States, an important trigger for shared prosperity was the scarcity of skilled labor and labor in general, which made employers find ways of saving on skills but making workers more productive.
Let's put a pin on that. I want to return to that point. I think it's very interesting when we think about our future. But let's leave Galore aside and look at then DeLong's approach. I mean, DeLong sees the most important change being not political but technological. The way he explained to me was that around 1870s, you start having a dramatic change in the way business is done because of the Industrial Research Lab, which is incorporated into modern corporation. This is, Nikola Tesla is his poster boy for this. But the basic idea being that you start having a routinization of innovation. It's not just no longer geniuses, but it becomes a routinized part of everyday life. And with that, you have such a dramatic technological advancement that with technology basically changing every generation, you have such a dynamic society. You have so much creative destruction that you cannot have these kind of calcified elites that just sit on top of it all, because you just have so much more dynamism and you have so much more growth that there is more to share for everyone.
It is absolutely true, and I agree 100% that industrial R&D being done more professionally was important. But it's not the sort of linchpin of history, in part because you have 100 plus years of economic growth before then, in which industrial R&D has no role whatsoever. As Joel Mukir also emphasizes, the early phases of industrial revolution was done by entrepreneurs who were tinkerers, who were practical men, a few women, that applied basic known knowledge and played around at the edges in order to make discoveries. So that was a major force of economic growth. Absolutely, the application of scientific methods was very important, especially for heavy industry, chemicals, and so on. But you don't see that as a transformative turning point that suddenly everything becomes more shared. So, for instance, in the United States, that is the phase in which you have, some very notable technological advances, for example, in railways, chemicals, and oil. But those are also the sectors that become highly monopolized. Those are the most conflictual sectors in some sense, where workers are repressed, politicians are bought and sold, rivals are intimidated, and that is not some sort of, oh, there is a lot of growth so we can all live happily. In fact, it's very conflictual, and it would have been a pretty disastrous turning point for the United States if that had remained that way. It's the progressive movements, muckrakers, media and civil society organization that we owe our sort of recovery from that period with institutional and again technological changes.
But hold on a second. Didn't that period, this kind of Gilded Age, didn't it see, yes, massive inequalities? And yes, I completely, I think most people would agree that it would have been a disaster if it would just continue. But it did also start seeing wage growth for the average worker.
It's a small amount of wage growth we see during that period. But what is very important, and that's why I'm emphasizing it, it's not like, oh, there's a lot of technological innovation, so we have a lot, so the conflict lessens. Economics has changed a lot here. So I wouldn't say, Jim Robinson and I in our previous books and Simon Johnson and I in our current book are alone here. But many economists are still underappreciating and underemphasizing the importance of conflict. At every turn they try to find a way of minimizing conflict. So that's what I'm trying to emphasize, that conflict is key. And why is conflict key? Because choices are key. There's nothing automatic about this.
But it is interesting because you brought your co-author James Robinson
Uh-huh.
in, with whom you've written the book that will probably be the most famous amongst listeners, which is Why Nations Fail, a really wonderful book that I highly recommend to everyone. And it's a wonderful book. So is your new one, and I do see some tension.
Well, we evolve, don't we?
Yeah, we do. But let me make the not the DeLong, not the Galore, but the Acemoglu 10 years ago argument, as far as I could understand it, which is that we wouldn't have been fine throughout history in terms of technological growth. But that's because we lived in highly extractive societies. So a wonderful example of this comes from the windmills in the Middle Ages in your book, where when some common peasants want to build their own windmill, the abbot tells them that you're absolutely not allowed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a highly extractive society, and therefore the common people cannot enjoy the benefits of technological progress. However, we now live in not perfectly inclusive societies, but for example, in the US or in Western Europe, we live in liberal democracies with all the kinds of things that Why Nations Fail as a book emphasizes: property rights, inclusive political institutions, relatively well-functioning democracies. Of course, we have a lot of flaws if we read the daily news, but from the broad sweep of history, of course, we live in deeply inclusive societies compared. And maybe now here, when you answer, you can maybe we can start moving and focusing more on your pessimism around the last 50 years, because I think that Why Nations Fail would have given me a much more optimistic view about where we would be going now, not about what medieval Europe looked like, but where the future is going, because that would have convinced me that it's enough to have technology plus these things like open markets, property rights, liberal democracy, and then we'll be happy ever after. So to the extent that there is a conflict there, and I am interpreting it right, how would you convince your past self that we're not going to be just rolling along?
Let me defend both perspectives in some sense, although it is true that my view and interpretation has changed a little bit. So Why Nations Fail is a more macro history. We're trying to explain, why the world is different today than it was in 1500, and why, say, Europe, Finland, Sweden, Germany, England are so much more prosperous than Latin America or Africa. From that macro perspective, I would completely agree with my earlier self that inclusive institutions are key. And one of the things that they do is actually allow technology adoption, and that technology adoption has been great. And looking again at that macro, from that macro perspective, I would say Silicon Valley is fantastic. Without Silicon Valley, you wouldn't have had the same level of entrepreneurship, risk taking, and innovativeness in the United States in a very, very important set of sectors centered on information technology and communication technologies. But once we zero in into our current episode, it's not just the technological change that becomes central, but it's the direction of technology. Then looking at the history from that point of view, you also see the direction of technology being quite a significant factor in other episodes as well. So, in that sense, at the macro perspective, Why Nations Fail omitted the important critical role of the direction of technology. So, the common thing about Why Nations Fail and my current perspective is that in both uh, approaches, in both books, the power structure matters. Who has the power to control technology. But in Why Nations Fail, the most important aspect that we emphasize is whether you allow those innovations and or whether you try to set up and live with a coercive structure.
Because the elites are better off without a dynamic economy.
Sometimes they are afraid of technology, sometimes
Yeah.
they don't see the need, sometimes they see it
Yeah.
as destabilizing. So those were the things that we emphasize in Why Nations Fail. Was that the full picture? No. Did I think at the time that was the full picture? No. But now I see it as more important to have also dwelled on the direction of
Yeah.
technology. But there's
Okay.
one other difference, and let me come back to that, which is again something that Jim and I were somewhat aware, but my thinking has evolved on this. Looking at Latin America, where for most of its history coercion has been rampant, and Africa to Asia, if you asked us about power, which also part of the subtitle of Why Nations Fail, we would have emphasized economic, political, and military power. But today, we argue, Simon and I argue, sorry, that persuasion power
Hmm.
is even more important than tanks and, armaments. This is why, Silicon Valley is a mixed blessing. It's the environment, it's the risk taking and entrepreneurship hub, but at the same time, it has become a dominant persuasive power over society, imposing its view of digital technologies, its view of future of technology, future of work, and making us complacent about inequality. And that
Okay.
I see as
And
very dangerous. And let me give you one example of what I mean by that. We just mentioned the progressive movement and how they reversed the whole of the robber barons. You might say they did something that was much harder. It should be much easier to do today because they didn't have direct democracy.
yeah.
Senators were not directly elected, and they were one of the biggest supporters of the robber barons because that's where they got their money for election or into their pockets. The federal government had no tools. There was no Federal Reserve, no income tax, no regulatory tools. It's very different from today. They did it then. We should be able to do it now. But actually, there's one big difference. I think the tech sector's persuasive power is much greater than what the robber barons
Hmm.
ever had.
Interesting. So Standard Oil was broken up, but Facebook isn't, partially because tech optimism has become, in a way, part of our ideology.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think for me, when thinking about whether the techno optimism is works or not, whether we should be techno optimists or more pessimists, I think one of the most striking things that I learned from your work is that um, real wages of a lot of people have been going up in, for example, the US for the past 50 years, but not for men without university education.
Well, actually, I emphasize men without a college degree or men with a high school degree because they are, the most striking.
They basically haven't had any wage growth.
They've had a wage decline, but
Mm.
it's not some people. 60% of the U.S. workforce does not have a college degree, and on average, that group has had zero or very little wage growth in for about 50 years.
And you have calculations suggesting that, do I remember right, that maybe 2/3 of this is because of automation, 1/3 because of globalization?
Yeah, something like that. And look, I mean, I think that's a really striking number. I just want to emphasize that. Simon and I start the book with two quotes, one in at the beginning of the chapter, the other one in the text of chapter 1 from H.G. Wells from The Time Machine, which was written more than 120 years ago. And H.G. Wells, a very smart person with some crazy ideas, but amazingly far-sighted opinions as well, saw two things as alarming at the time. And I think we have forgotten those lessons. One is that technology is not just about control over nature, but it's about control of human over human. We're living through that. And second, he thought that this was a sufficiently dangerous thing that the human race could evolve into two completely segregated species, the powerful and the less powerful. I wouldn't go that far, but it is clear that we have created a two-tiered society in the United States. The social status, the regards, the self-worth that people are allowed to have really depends on whether you have a college degree or not. And that is again ideological, that is again a social choice, and it is a function of technology and how we're using technology.
The problem, I mean, I think that it's easy for anyone listening to agree. And just looking at the political consequences, of course, we can see how difficult the situation is. But what is the alternative? Because you're not a break the machine, let's go back to Stone Age kind of person.
Oh, absolutely not. I am an optimist. Look, I'm an optimist for the following reason. So let's see. So this is the On Humans podcast. So this is a really important part of the argument. First of all, every time you question anything that is being done in the current technological field, every time you question Silicon Valley, you are accused of being a Luddite.
Yeah, machine breaker.
I am not a Luddite, even though I think, the history of the Luddites is completely misinterpreted. Luddites were not just break the machines, they were trying to complain about the way in which the machines were being used. But let's leave that aside. I am not saying we should block technological change. Far from it. I think technological change has been an engine of prosperity and will be an engine of prosperity if we use it right. If you want an analogy, those who say block the technology are like trying to stop the flow of a river. That's both inadvisable and very, very difficult. What I'm saying is let's redirect some of the flow towards places where it will do less damage and it will create more social good. And I have a very specific way in which I think we should conceptualize the social good from technology. Unfortunately, this is a word Simon and I do not use in the book. We should have, but I would summarize it as saying a pro-human direction of technology. And what I mean by pro-human is technological changes that are complementary to humans, that increase their capabilities, increase their information, their decision-making capability, their agency, their productivity, rather than sidelining them. Automation is something that's going to go on forever. I'm completely in favor of automation, but not when the only thing you do is automation. Because if you automate work and you don't do anything else, where do humans go? No, if you look at successful periods in which shared prosperity was built, you see a lot of automation, but you also see a lot of new tasks and new responsibilities for humans. That's what we should do.
And how do we do that?
I'll come back to that. But if you look at periods in which humans are cast aside, their agency is reduced, their autonomy is reduced, those are often sad periods, like the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. When you take people's decision making capacity, when you turn them into cogs in the machine, that's not what's pro human. You give them more choices, better decision making capabilities, better information. If you manipulate humans, they don't become good citizens, they don't become good democrats. You have to use technology not in an anti-democratic way, but in a pro-democratic way. Actually, if you look from the outside, perhaps that's how it appears from Helsinki, and it definitely that's how many people from DC and New York interpret it. They look at Silicon Valley and they see, oh, these are very globalist, pro-democratic people. But I would actually say the general tendency in Silicon Valley is anti-democratic. Why? Because they do not appreciate the unique, versatile skills of humans. They see humans as fallible, making mistakes, needing to be steered by geniuses or by machines. That is not a pro-human direction. I don't think a society in which we do not respect, value, and enable the work that people who work with their hands do is going to be a happy society. An electrician, a carpenter, a gardener is as much doing a valuable, useful work as you and I sitting in our offices and doing mental work. But right now, we are giving you an amazing set of tools. Look at the tools that you have available at your fingertips for recording, for reaching the roar.
Yeah, it really is
And
wonderful.
what about the electricians? We're not giving them anything. We're not giving them any tools. There are tremendous needs in the United States and in Europe for more and more electrical work. But we're not training electricians. We're not giving them any tools to identify problems, more complex problems in real time. We can do those easily. We can make them better decision maker, more informed, better trained. We're not
Yeah.
doing that. So AI, artificial intelligence, and digital technologies, they are actually amazing tools for increasing human capabilities. That's not how we are using them. And that's because of this anti-democratic mindset in Silicon Valley.
And I think wonderful example of that is when Elon Musk said that he himself made a mistake trying to only use as much robots as possible.
Exactly. Well, at least Elon Musk admitted it.
Yeah, and he literally said humans are underrated.
Yes. Well, he said
And
that, but then he's continued to, you know, doing some
yeah,
of the same things, but at least he admitted it.
and you would say that Germany here provides a better path. In Germany, you see more use of robots than in the US in, for example, car manufacturing, but in a way that you say is actually conducive to people still working there with the robots. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are many things I don't want to eulogize Germany. There are many things that are not sufficiently risk taking in Germany. There are problems in the service sector and the supply chain in Germany. But for the big part of the manufacturing industry, you see German firms much better at using human skills. Why? First of all, labor is scarce in Germany. Just like in the 19th century in the United States, scarce labor becomes valuable. They do better. They have unions and work councils that provide an institutional basis for more pro human directions of technology. They have a wonderful training system that prepares people to have a variety of job specific, industry specific skills so they become more valuable to the companies. So rather than just sideline them, they train them even more. They turn them into technical employees.
It's a wonderful idea. I mean, I never thought of unions in this way of how they can create unions and labor rights can create a kind of virtuous circle where if you have invested in them and if it's not easy to just sack them, you find ways to complement them rather than sidelining them.
Absolutely. But again, let me warn you, you are right not to have thought of it this way, because if you look at the UK and the United States, unions have often not played that role because union management relationship has been conflictual enough that that more cooperative role has not emerged. But if you look at your own country, Finland, if you look at Sweden, you see more of that, and you see that in Germany, different institutional settings, different things being done.
Very interesting.
But you do need, I mean, I was originally skeptical of the corporatist model. I was in graduate school, I was somewhat skeptical because I thought too much of collusion between business leaders and governments. But I think the corporatist model is a wonderful way of taming the more conflictual parts so that workers and capital can work together.
Well, can we do 3 questions, but you have 1 minute to answer them?
Of course.
Will demography solve all of our problems? Because we have societies where on the one hand, we talk about everybody being mass unemployed because of AI. On the other hand, we talk about not having enough workers because our demographic structure is so bad and we have so many elderly people.
Yes, I think demography will help. First of all, Pascual Restrepo and I have a paper that shows that a very large fraction of cross-country variation in robot adoption or automation adoption is explained by demographic factors, and countries that get their act together, such as Germany, South Korea, Japan, in response to demographic shocks, can use technologies in a way that works very well. And in fact, we have another paper that shows that fears of aging leading to macroeconomic imbalances or slow growth seem to be overrated. So, yes, demographic factors are going to be useful. But again, institutions are key. If you have demographic change and you have the wrong institution, it's going to be a big, big mix, combustible mix that is very dangerous. So, the institutional adjustments has to facilitate the technological adjustment.
So far, we have basically only focused on the rich world in our conversation. And in the rich world, especially in the US, you see there's quite a pessimistic view of the past 50 years and where we are going, although the demography brings some optimism. But is it a wrong perspective? Should we say that the last 50 years have been the best 50 years because we have created a global middle class from China to Poland to Brazil? Outside of the core of non-college educated US graduates, things look pretty good.
I think that is a very, very important point, and I do not want to understate the achievements that have been made in China, in India, in other parts of the emerging world over the last 50 years. But I would say that we have also failed to grasp the opportunities. The type of globalization that we had during the last 50 years was not the one that would have served the working classes in the emerging world either. Yes, China has a huge middle class, but workers are still being paid very low wages. There's a lot of coercion. Inequality has exploded in India, in Turkey, in China, in Indonesia. Again, I don't think that sort of inequality was a natural consequence of globalization or the spread of industrial technologies. It is the form of globalization, labor repression in many countries, then creating a comparative advantage that was unleashed on Western workers in an uncontrolled way, and that benefited Communist Party officials and corrupt businessmen in China, but it hasn't really benefited Chinese workers or Indian workers as much as it should have done.
But what would be the alternative?
The alternative would be a much more gradual and pro-worker direction in industrialization in these countries as well. China did not need to repress wages so much to have a comparative advantage in low value-added, labor-intensive manufacturing. And if it hadn't done that, it would have had an even bigger middle class and a much more prosperous working class.
Okay, last question. All the wonderful work that you've done throughout the years, thank you so much for it. And how has that shaped your outlook on our species?
I think that's a wonderful question. Thank you, Larry. And I think that 20 years ago, I would not have known how to answer this question. At least now I have an answer. And I think the answer to me is that we have not fully appreciated and celebrated the amazing diversity, creativity, adaptability, and unique, versatile skills that humans have. It is such an amazing outcome of evolution and institutional innovations and adaptations that we have built amazing societies with a very rich cultural diversity. And I would like to emphasize this point because there are two sets of currents that I think undervalue those skills. One is the drive for autonomous machine intelligence, especially now fueled with generative AI, which sidelines humans, undervalues humans, puts them not in the driver's seat, but in the back seat at the best of conditions. And the second, again, this sort of ideological current that puts people who work with their minds miles ahead of people who work with their hands. It's really the combination of hand and mind, our ability to reason and interact with the physical world that is so special about us, and that creates all that versatile diversity and enables many, many, many millions of us, billions of us to contribute to our very rich world and that we have built in the 21st century. So I think celebrating that great skills and versatility of humans is a central thing for the future.
Professor Daron Acemoglu, thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry. It was a great conversation.
So that was it. That was the episode. Thank you as always for listening. If you like this episode, if you like the podcast more generally, then please do consider showing some support. It can be as simple as sharing the episode, subscribing to the show if you haven't done so, giving a nice review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, etc. Or if you want to show some financial support, you can do so via patreon.com. That would be really warmly welcome. Thank you for considering. But most importantly, I hope that you tune in next time. Until then, take care.